What's up guys, today I'm going to be showing you how to grow your forearms. Now your forearms are composed of two main sections, an anterior group of muscles and a posterior group of muscles. Each of these sections consist of many small muscles making up the lower portion of your arm, each one with a different origin, insertion, and function. However, nearly all of the muscles in your forearm work together to create strength and stability in your wrist anytime you grip an object against resistance. That being said, you can actually emphasize each group of muscles by altering the motion of your wrist since both groups perform different primary functions. So let's take a closer look. The anterior group of the forearm consists of all the muscles on the front of your lower arm, each performing one of two distinct functions. The first is flexion, either of the wrist or fingers, which is carried out by the flexor muscles. The ones that lie superficial, closest to the skin, will flex the wrist, and the ones that lie deep, furthest from the skin, will flex the fingers. The second function is pronation, or the rotation of the forearm to point your palms behind you, which is carried out by the pronator muscles. Luckily for you, both pronation and finger flexion occur rather naturally throughout your workout, so they aren't completely necessary to isolate. Wrist flexion, on the other hand, doesn't occur naturally, therefore it's much more worthy of isolation. To achieve this, many exercises can be employed. First, with dumbbells, is the seated wrist curl. Sit on a bench with the dumbbells firmly in the palms of your hands and place the back of your wrists on the end of your knees with your elbows comfortably on your thighs. Then, fully extend your wrists by lowering your knuckles to the ground, letting the dumbbells fall into your fingers. From here, curl the weight up by flexing your wrists and bring the dumbbells back into the base of your palms while squeezing your forearms at the top. And if for some reason the dumbbells feel wobbly or uncomfortable, you can also perform this with a barbell using the exact same technique as previously mentioned. I personally prefer this method since I find that the fixed bar keeps my wrists much more evenly aligned, which leads to a greater contraction at the top. The next exercise is the standing wrist curl, pretty much the same thing as the seated wrist curl, except without a bench. Just make sure to keep your shoulders, elbows, and wrists locked in place to ensure that your forearms do the work. Only your hands should be moving, all other parts of your arms should be stagnant. If you're having trouble with this, you can also perform this with a pair of dumbbells by your side to prevent your wrists from drifting forward. Again, let the weight fall into your fingers at the bottom and squeeze it in your palms at the top for a full stretch and contraction. Doing this allows you to utilize a bit more range of motion and also incorporates finger flexion without having to worry about keeping your arms still. Moving on to the next barbell option is the wrist roller. Using a pronated grip, roll the bar so that the top of the plate spin forward. To do this, grab the bottom of the bar in one hand with your wrist aligned with your forearm, then flex your wrist to curl it towards your body. As you do this, loosen your grip in your other hand to let the bar spin against it, then immediately repeat this process with your opposite wrist so that you create a nice constant rotation of the bar. And again, although it isn't necessary to isolate finger flexion, it can be achieved in a few different ways if you're looking to take your forearm training to the next level. Some of these include plate pinches, farmer's walks, and towel holds. Just make sure that when you perform these, keep your arms locked out and squeeze your fingers as hard as you can. And since all of these train the forearms isometrically, start by choosing a weight you can hold for 30 seconds and slowly increase that week by week until you can hold it for 45 seconds. Then increase the weight and repeat. And if you don't like doing isometric holds, you can also use one of these hand grips to train more of a dynamic movement of the fingers, which also makes it a bit easier to progressively overload. However, if you don't have access to it, I wouldn't worry too much about trying to include these, since again, finger isolation isn't necessary for everyone. But now that we've covered the front of the forearm, let's turn over to the back. This section, known as the posterior group, consists of all the muscles on the back of your lower arm, each performing one of three distinct functions. The first is extension, either of the wrist or fingers, which is carried out by the extensor muscles. The ones that lie deep, furthest from the skin, will extend the fingers, and the ones that lie superficial, closest to the skin, will extend the wrist, with one exception of the extensor digiti minimi, which extends the pinky. The second function is elbow flexion, or the bending of the elbow joint, which is carried out by the brachioradialis, the largest portion of your lower arm. And finally, the last function of the posterior forearm is supination. This is the rotation of the forearm to point your palms in front of you, which is carried out by the supinator. Now, as many of you know, supination and elbow flexion are both functions of the biceps, which is why they occur in most bicep exercises. So assuming that you're training your biceps, you won't really need to isolate the supinator. The brachioradialis, however, is worthy of isolation since it cannot contribute to supination. Along with this, wrist extension is also useful to incorporate as it typically gets neglected in your training. Finger extension, on the other hand, isn't really as necessary since nearly all of the muscles performing this compose the deep compartment of the forearm and thus don't appear superficially. So in order to most efficiently grow this portion of your forearm, you really only have to focus on the wrist extensors and the brachioradialis. So let's start with wrist extension. First, with dumbbells, is the seated wrist extension. Sit on a bench with the dumbbells firmly in the palms of your hands and place the front of your wrists on the end of your knees with the middle of your forearms resting on your thighs. Then lower your knuckles to the ground until your fingers make contact with your legs, then lift the weight up by extending your wrists and squeezing at the top. Similar to wrist curls, you can also perform this with a barbell using the exact same technique as previously mentioned. However, I actually prefer to use dumbbells since in this case, I find that the fixed bar limits my range of motion and doesn't allow me to tilt my hands outwards, which I find more comfortable. But again, just do what's best for you. The next exercise is the standing wrist extension. Again, pretty much the same thing as the seated wrist extension, except without a bench. However, due to the limited range of motion resulting from holding the bar against your body, you aren't able to flex your wrist at the bottom for a full stretch of the forearm. Thus, if you can, I recommend just doing these seated to allow for a better stretch and contraction. Moving on to the next barbell option is the wrist roller. Simply utilize the same technique as before, before, except this time, roll the bar so that the top of the plate spin backwards, and instead of flexing your wrist towards you to turn the bar, extend it away from you. Now that we have the extensors out of the way, let's talk about the brachioradialis. To recap, this muscle is the largest portion of your forearm, responsible for performing elbow flexion, but it cannot assist with supination. So even though it's active during your normal bicep curls, it's much better emphasized with an overhand grip, since removing supination places your biceps in a biomechanically disadvantageous position, allowing the brachioradialis to take over. A great exercise that achieves this is the reverse curl. To perform this, grab either a pair of dumbbells or a barbell with a pronated grip, with either your thumbs wrapped over or around. Then curl the weight up to your chest by bending your elbows while keeping them locked in place, and slowly control the weight back. And don't be afraid to initiate slight wrist flexion where your knuckles point down if that's more comfortable for you. And with that, we've explained the functions of both groups of the forearm, including how to emphasize each group and some of the exercises you can perform to do so. But just keep in mind, it isn't absolutely necessary to train your forearms directly, assuming you get enough indirect work from other exercises in your routine. But if you do want to grow them specifically, or you notice that they're lagging behind other muscles, feel free to add a few exercises into your routine. I recommend choosing one that incorporates wrist flexion to bias the flexors of the anterior group, one that incorporates wrist extension to bias the extensors of the posterior group, and one that incorporates elbow flexion with an overhand grip to bias the brachioradialis. So for example, if your goal is simply to build muscle, your best selection of exercises is the wrist curl, wrist extension, and reverse curl. However, if you're more focused on improving grip strength, it's a much better idea to include isometrics such as towel holds, farmer carries, and plate pinches, since these allow you to challenge all parts of your forearm in a static position. To add these to your routine, I find it best to do 3 to 4 sets of 12 to 20 reps for each exercise, for a total of 1 to 2 sessions per week. And since your forearms are already involved in most upper body exercises, it wouldn't be a bad idea to train them at the end of either a push day or a pull day. That way, you aren't creating unnecessary grip fatigue in the beginning of your workout, and you're able to train your forearms efficiently close to failure. That's it for this video. Feel free to leave a like if you enjoyed, comment what you want to see next, and subscribe for more.